Hi, my name is Kyle from Web Dev Simplified, and I created this modern Getting Started with JavaScript workshop to not only help you with understanding the fundamentals of JavaScript, but more importantly, to empower you as a developer so that you can feel confident every single time you try to write code for a project. In this course, we're going to get started by talking about the fundamentals of what JavaScript is and things like variables, loops, if statements, and control flow. Then we're going to move on to some more complicated topics like closures and reference versus value, before wrapping up by talking about how you can interact with the DOM, and most importantly, how you can actually debug your applications, which is going to give you the confidence that you need as a developer. Dive into your first JavaScript project with confidence. Now, when it comes to variables, we obviously need a way to create our own variables because we've hard-coded everything. We wrote out true, we wrote out the number 42, whatever it is. We're hard-coding all of our different numbers. And oftentimes you want to be able to store these values to use them in multiple places inside your code. This is the idea where variables come in. I like to think of a variable as like a box. It's a box that you put a label on and then you put something inside that box. So imagine you have a shoebox, you put a label on it that says decorations, and then you throw some decorations in that box. You have essentially created a variable called decoration that has some content inside of it. That is the whole idea of variables in JavaScript. Now there's technically 3 different ways you can create variables inside of JavaScript. We're going to be focusing on the first way, which is let, and essentially that's a keyword that lets you create a variable. So how you do it is you type out this keyword let, L-E-T, you put a space afterwards, and then you type in whatever the name of the variable you want is. Now that variable name can be just like this on its own, or you can give it a default value. So to give it a default value, you use this equal sign followed by whatever value you want to use. So let's take a look at creating a variable. We can just say let my name equal, and we can pass it in any value, which in our case is going to be Kyle. I have now created essentially a box with a label, my name on it, and I put the string Kyle directly inside that box. And now I can use that variable anywhere else in my code. So to use that variable, I just type out the name I give it. So I can say console.log, and I can pass in my name, and now you can see it prints out that name. Essentially, it takes whatever the value of that variable is, and it inserts that anywhere you use this name. You can almost think about it as like a find and replace. It replaces every instance of my name with whatever this variable value I define is. This makes it really easy for you to essentially use the same value in multiple different places inside your code. Now, an important thing about naming variables in JavaScript is they follow a specific naming convention. It's not required you follow this convention, but it is a general convention that most programmers use. And that is that if you have multiple words in your variable name, for example, my name is 2 separate words, the first word is always going to be all lowercase, and every word after that, the second, third, fourth, and so on, is going to start with a capital letter. This is often referred to as camel casing because we start with that lowercase, and then the start of every word after that is going to be an uppercase letter. Again, I don't have to do that. I could spell it my name like this, and if I spell my name like this, you'll see there's no errors inside my code. It still works, but it's a general convention that most people follow, which makes it easier to actually read what the variable names are inside of your code. Now, it's important that you also don't put spaces or anything in your variable name. You may think, okay, my name is 2 words. I'll put a space inside of here, and I'll put a space here. But when I do that, it's going to break. Variable names must be all one single word with no spaces at all inside them. We'll fix this code back to what it was before. And now we can kind of talk about the rest of how these variables work. First of all, if you don't want to give a variable a value, you can leave that equals portion off. So I can just completely leave this portion off. And now my variable has no value to start with, which is perfectly okay. Generally, you're probably going to have a value for your variable though. Now you can also update a variable value. So for example, my name is Kyle right now, but maybe I changed my name. I can come in here and I can update that variable name. All you do is you type the name of the variable you want to update, followed by the equal sign, followed by the new value you want to give it. So I'm going to say my new name is Sally. Now when I print my name out down here, it is Sally. While if I print my name out up here, you'll notice it's Kyle. Then I change it to Sally and it prints out Sally down here. So it allows me to keep track of what my variable is, and I can update that variable when certain things change. For example, if I have like a count variable, I can initialize that count at 1, and then later I can add 1 to my count, so I can say my count is equal to count plus 1. So let's just come in here, we can log this out just to show you that this works. You can see we log out 1, then since we add 1 to our count and resave it back to our variable, we now get the value of 2. So updating variables works perfectly fine, and it's a great way to keep track of things that change over time inside of your code. Now the big benefits of using variables, first of all, it's much easier to read what your code is. For example, I have this really nice name that tells me exactly what this value is. It is count. If I just had the number 1 somewhere in my code, I don't know what the number 1 means. It could mean anything, you know? So having this well-defined variable name is really nice. I can also reuse this variable multiple places, as you can see here. I'm reusing that variable and it saves that same value. and you can update that value as it changes. So variables are just a great way to store information, update it, and then reuse it throughout your code in various places. And you're going to be defining variables all the time. Now, const is another way that you can create variables, and this allows you to create variables that don't change. It's essentially the exact same thing as let, but constant variables do not change. So if we come back into our code and I change this variable to const, just replace the word let with const, otherwise everything is exactly the same, we're actually going to get an error because I'm trying to change the value of this constant variable, but it's a constant, so it cannot change, so we're going to get an error. Const variables are great when you want to create something that you know will never change. It allows you to essentially tell that to the world saying, hey, this will not change, so if I'm writing code and I try to change it, it'll give me an error, which makes it easier to understand how my code works. Another difference between let and const is that you must give a constant variable a default value. So if I were to leave off a default value here and save, I'm going to get an error. And that makes sense because defining a variable and then not giving it a value, and it's a variable that can never change, that doesn't really make sense. So you must give a constant value some type of default variable or default value that it can fall back on. Otherwise, besides those two minor differences, they work pretty much exactly the same. You just need to make sure you give it a value and that you never reassign it. Now you're probably wondering, okay, there's two different ways to make variables. How do I know which one I want to use? Why don't I just use let? Because it's the more flexible of the two. Personally, I try to default to using const pretty much whenever I can. The reason that const is really nice to use because if I see a constant variable in code, I know it'll never change. So I don't have to worry about keeping track of what the value is here and what the value may be later. I know it'll always have the exact same value everywhere inside of my code. While let, I don't actually know that is going to be the case. So I try to use const anytime that I can, but as soon as I have a variable where I need to keep track of something or it's going to update, then I swap from a constant variable over to a let variable. Normally in JavaScript, your code runs top to bottom, but with control flow, we can determine what code actually runs, if it doesn't run, how many times it runs. It allows us to do much more complex stuff inside of our code. So an if statement is the most basic term for a control flow, and that allows you to do something if a statement is true, otherwise don't do it at all. So here we have an age variable, age is equal to 18. If the age is greater than or equal to 18, then we can run some code like you can vote. Otherwise, it'll run some other code afterwards. So let's just copy this over to see exactly what's going on. Paste that in, get rid of these comments that are not needed. There we go. And you can see here inside of our code, we run you can vote and we're running program continues. So an if statement, essentially to create one, you write out the code if for if, followed by a space. Technically the space is optional, but to make it easier to read, I like to put a space. Then inside of these parentheses, we put whatever condition we want to check. And this would be a condition that returns true or false. So here we're checking is age greater than or equal to 18. Since technically in our case, age is greater than or equal to 18, this will return true. And if the stuff in this parentheses returns true, all the code in these brackets are run. But let's say our age is actually only 10. Well, 10 is not greater than or equal to 18. So you'll notice when we run our code, it skips everything inside of these brackets because this evaluates to false. So if allows you to actually run certain code if something is true, otherwise it skips it if that value is false. So this allows us to conditionally run different aspects of our code. You'll also notice the code outside the parentheses, or the brackets, is run every single time because if only cares about the code directly inside of those curly brackets. Now with if, you can also do something called an if-else statement. So sometimes you want to run one set of code if something's true and a different set of code if something is false. This is where the else keyword comes in. So all you need to do to create an if-else statement is you take your normal if statement as is. All you do is add the word else directly after your final closing bracket right here. And then you put in new curly brackets, which are going to define the code that runs in the else statement condition. So I can just say console.log, you are too young. And now you can see it actually prints out you are too young because this evaluates to false. And if it evaluates to false, it'll run whatever code is inside the else section. And this can be multiple lines of code or a single line of code. I could have 10 different lines of code inside of here. It doesn't matter. Just all the code inside those curly braces will run based on if the condition is true or if this condition is false. If I change this back to 18, you'll now see it runs you can vote and completely skips everything inside this else section. We can even take this a step further by checking multiple different things by using an else if condition. So here is another example. We'll just keep modifying our code here, but if you want to do an else if, all you need to do is after your if statement, you write out the word else, followed by the word if, and then you put another set of parentheses with a new check that you want to do. So let's say here, now if the age is greater than or equal to 15, we can run a different set of code. You can just say console.log close,
but not old enough. There we go. And then we have our normal else statement still there. Technically, I don't need this else. It's entirely optional, but I'll leave it on there for now. So now we can run our code. And if the person is between 18 and 15, for example, they are 15, you'll see it runs close but not old enough. So what happens inside of our code is first it's going to check to see if they are old enough by checking age greater than or equal to 18. This returns false. And if it returns false, it skips down to the next if statement. And then it checks that one. In our case, age is greater than or equal to 15. This is true, so it runs the code inside of these brackets, and then it goes to the very end after all of our other stuff, and it continues on with our program. If, for example, our age was only 12, which is not old enough for either, it'll do this check, which returns false. It'll move to the next check, which also returns false. And then it'll move down to the else statement, which is kind of our fallback for if everything returns false, and it'll run the code directly inside of here. While if they were old enough, for example, 18, this one will return true, it'll run the code inside those brackets, and then skip all the way to the very end. So this allows us to essentially run one of many different blocks based on different conditions that we have true or false inside of our code. The important thing to note, though, is with an if, it only ever runs at most one of these conditions. So you can never run multiple different conditions. And if I were to remove this else, for example, and I had the age set to young, you'll notice none of the code inside of here runs because none of my conditions return true. Now moving on, I want to talk about event listeners, which are probably the core thing you're going to be doing inside of the DOM. And event listeners are what makes the page actually interactive. So when you click on a button or do something, you can run code based on those actions. And these events can be literally anything, but for the most part, they're different things that the user does with the page. Clicking on a button, typing in an input field, resizing the window even has a specific event we can listen for. Now, the basic event listeners in JavaScript are going to be like a click event listener. So let's go ahead and look at what creating a click event listener would look like. Let's say we have a button here, and that's just going to be equal to document.querySelector, and we want to get a button. And of course, we'll want to add a button onto our page. So inside of here, instead of this H1, we'll just add in a button that just says click. There we go. So now you can see we have a button on the right-hand side of our screen. Now that we've selected that button, to add an event listener to it, we can say button dot, and of course, we have a ton of different properties. The one we care about is add event listener. So type out the word add event listener. That allows you to add an event listener, and this takes a few different properties. The first thing that you need to pass to it is the type of event you want to listen for. You can see there are a lot of events inside of JavaScript. For the most part, you're probably only going to use a handful of these events, maybe 3, 4, 5 of them at any given time. The most common is going to be the click event listener. This allows you to do something when you click on an element. In our case, when we click on our button, we want to run some code. To determine what type of code we want to run, we need to pass it a function. So we're going to be using an inline arrow function, which is what I generally use for these types of situations. And now, anytime we click on a button, the code inside of here is going to run. So I'm just going to say console log clicked. So it's going to just print out clicked to the console every time I click my button. You'll notice by default, nothing happens. But as soon as I click on this button, you can see the text clicked gets printed out in my console. And every single time I click that, it just keeps logging out clicked over and over again. So the key to add event listener is you need to make sure you call it on some type of element on your page. You pass it in the type of event that you want to listen for, and then you pass it the code you want to run whenever that event occurs, whether it's a click or an input or any other type of event that you care about. Now, moving on, we can add event listeners to anything. For example, we can add them to specific elements like an input element or a button. We can add them directly to the document. We can even add event listeners directly to the window object itself. It really depends on where you want those event listeners to live. You can also add multiple event listeners to the same exact object. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to add a brand new event listener to our button. This one will say clicked 2, and this first one will say clicked 1. There we go. And now when we click on our button, you're probably thinking, okay, what will happen? Is it going to log out clicked 2? Is it going to log out clicked 1? Is it going to log out both? Well, what happens in JavaScript is whenever you add event listeners, they just keep adding on. They don't overwrite each other. So when I click on this, you'll notice it prints out clicked 1, and it'll print out clicked 2. It essentially puts them out in whatever order you add them. So I first add clicked 1, and then I add clicked 2. So it's going to run the first one I add first, and the second one that I add second. So every time you add event listeners, it just keeps piling them on to each other until eventually you get all the event listeners that you want. They never overwrite each other or remove each other. Now, speaking of removing event listeners though, obviously sometimes you want to stop having an event listener inside of your code. To do that is a little bit complicated, and you'll definitely run into some problems potentially. So first of all, let's create a function that we want to do. So we'll say function print click. And this is a function that's just going to console.log clicked. So at least we have something that'll show up inside of our page whenever we click on our button. And we want that to be the thing we add as our event listener. So here, instead of passing that function in line, we'll just pass that print click function just like this. And now if we've done everything correctly, clicking the button should log out the text clicked. But let's say that we eventually want to remove that. We don't want to have that on there anymore. Well, I can come in here and I can actually remove that by just saying button.remove event listener. So it's the opposite of add. Instead of add, we remove the event listener. We then need to tell it what type of event we want to listen for or to remove. In our case, we're removing a click event listener. And finally, we want to tell it what function we're removing. In our case, we're removing the print click function. Now, when I click on this button, you'll notice it doesn't actually print anything because we removed the event listener. Now, you may be wondering why I went ahead and created a brand new function for print click. Why don't I just do it inline? So let's go ahead and do that. We'll just make this an inline function, turn it back into an arrow function, just like that. And we'll do the exact same thing down here. So now we are essentially adding that clicked function and we're removing that clicked function. So it seems like it should be doing the same thing. But when we click over here, you'll notice it's still logging out clicked. The reason for that brings us all the way back to reference versus value. These functions, while they look exactly the same, they reference two different places because we create a brand new function here and we're creating a brand new function here. So these are two entirely separate functions that have no idea about each other. So when I add this function, it adds it fine. And when I go to remove this function, it's trying to remove a function that is brand new. It doesn't already exist on it. So whenever you want to remove a function as an event listener, you need to make sure that you have it as a separate function so they can both reference the same thing. You can see here print click and print click both reference this same exact original function. This is one of the biggest problems you'll run into is passing inline functions to add event listener means that you can never remove them. You need to specifically pass a reference to some other function to be able to remove it at a later point.